But yes, hi, I'm Adina. I am a research scientist here in New York. This is the office, you can see it. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys today a bit about grammatical gender and some other related noun classification systems. I called this presentation, How Strongly Does Grammatical Gender Correlate with the Lexical Semantics of Nouns? And of course, you're probably reading that and thinking, oh, there's a presupposition in here that it does. And you're right, that presupposition is kind of giving away one of the results. The answer is yes, it does. And so then the next question would be, how much? What does that mean? And I'll at least have an answer to the how much question. And maybe I'll wave my hands at the what does it mean question. So yeah, before I get too far into it, I want to start by saying something that probably all of you know, but it's always good to start with this to make sure we're on the same page. There's different meanings for the term gender in language. There's the meaning that people are really familiar with, maybe from watching the news about Andrew Cuomo or just being a part of a person in society, which is gender as a sociocultural phenomenon. So this encompasses things like gender identity, gender expression, and the social political ramifications of these things. In NLP, it encompasses things like fairness and inclusion, and there's just so much other stuff going on, like, what is the nature of classification in, conceptual classification? What is the nature of classification in language? All of this. And this is kind of the most, at least for humans or many humans, the most salient reading of this word gender. And this is kind of the reading that I'm not going to focus on as much today. Since this is a multilingual and typology group, the meaning of gender that I'm going to focus on is gender as a grammatical phenomenon. So this is the morphological marking that appears notably on nouns and then maybe things nearby like articles, adjectives, etc. This grammatical gender appears across all the nouns in a language for languages that have it. At least I think for every language that have it, it's across all the nouns. And it allows us to do things like resolve references to entities. And even though it's not really a big thing in English, just, peppered around on pronouns and stuff, across other languages, it's very common. So this is the one we're going to focus on today, although there will be little pieces here and there that talk about the sociocultural bits. It's very common across the world languages, as I said. I'm sure you're all familiar with WALS, but this is the results, the spread of languages that mark grammatical gender across the globe from the WALS database. And if you look at the number of surveyed WALS languages, which is 257, of those 112 mark grammatical gender. So this is a pretty good proportion. It's nearly half. So this is not just some kind of unique phenomenon that's kind of restricted to one family of languages. It's pretty widespread across the entire globe and across many different language families. So it's a really important phenomenon to pay attention to. As you probably know, whenever linguistics is at play, there are many theories about whatever phenomenon it might be, and also a bunch of opinions, which may or may not be good. So gender is no exception. Theories and opinions about it kind of abound, and they've gone back for a while historically as well. Gender, at least historically, is thought of as sort of like a mysterious feature, since it appears on inanimate nouns as well as animate nouns. People kind of wonder, like, what does it mean? Can we unify what gender is supposed to be doing, what it's for, what it means? And it goes back at least to William of Ockham. It says, it's arbitrary and meaningless. There's no means gender at all. Whether a noun gets, in like German or something, gets feminine or masculine or neuter just seems to be sort of like the luck of the draw. Similarly, Bloomfield, one of the fathers of linguistics, if you trace the Chomskyan line, for example, back, it hits Bloomfield, not too many steps. He said that there's no practical or obvious criteria for determining gender. And at least for me, I can attest to the last one. It's really hard for second language learners to learn gender in new languages. There's also some, of course, actual research on this. Other people have said various other mysterious things about it. So perhaps gender is creative. It gives you some kind of additional layer of meaning on top of a noun that isn't particularly necessarily related to its precise referent. So if a table is feminine, maybe there's some sort of creative relation to femininity that's happening. Some also have shown or argued, at least like this paper by Malvi et al. From 2015, that the gender marking itself facilitates communicative efficiency in some way, perhaps by adding some layer of redundancy. And there's a bunch of research from psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics that show the gender marking itself is important for online processing. So if you mark a noun, say, with the wrong gender, people will get really confused. And if you maybe ablate portions of the concord of gender, so how it spreads across the noun phrase, people will have a harder time processing the sentence. And it seems to speed up processing in languages that have it. So it seems like there's tons of conflicting ideas going around. And the main, I guess, contrast in these ideas that I want to pick out is does gender mean something or doesn't it? Is the relationship arbitrary or is it meaningful? And generally, when there's some sort of complete conflict like this in linguistics, it's because there's some generalization that has been missed. And you probably can guess what the generalization is, at least so far. But Corbett has a really good way of pointing to it. I kind of hinted at it earlier, which is that the contribution of gender to semantics or to the meaning is clearer for animates than inanimates. So in languages that mark gender, human nouns get marked with gender or any animate noun. And that marking generally reflects the gender identity of the person, or in the case of like an animal, the biological sex of that animal. So this slide is just to make sure we're on the same page with what I mean by gender, what I mean by concord. So this is an example from Spanish. These are two cats. See that I know these cats, and I know that one is a male cat and one is a female cat. This brown one is the male. If I'm referring to them, the way that the word is actually pronounced, referring to these different animals, will be different. So if it's a male, the noun gato for cat will reflect the maleness on this O. And if it's a female, gata will reflect the femaleness on this a. And if I'm referring to these creatures, even saying the same thing about them, like the small cat, he or she is cute, you can see that the biological sex of the animal will like reflect across the entire utterance. So it'll appear on determiners like el versus la, on adjectives, pequeño versus pequeña, pronouns like el versus ella, and then again, adjectives like lindo and linda for cute. So it really does matter in these languages what the biological sex of this animal is. You need to know it to correctly say these things about these cats. So it's clear here, at least, that there is meaning, a direct relationship between some sort of meaning, biological sex, and the grammatical structure of the sentence. Another reason to argue that at least that gender is meaningful in some sense, taking the split of animates and inanimates as sort of an initial generalization, it's meaningful on animates, it's not meaningful on inanimates, is that humans are animate, and we obviously, our societies at least, care a lot about gender identity. And so it has deep social implications. We have to pay attention to it. And especially for NLP, these sort of implications have become more noticeable and have come to the fore in the last couple of years. So gender biases in NLP systems resulting from human gender have been found in like machine translation, captions, speech recognition, basically everywhere everyone looks. Word embedding's the whole thing. This is from a recent, somewhat recent literature review from, I think, 2 years ago now. Ooh, time flies. But basically, anywhere that we talk about people, we're going to have these kind of gender biases in our systems. So it's clear that gender means something on animate human nouns. So obviously it means something. It can't be completely arbitrary. And at least it means something on animates. So the question is, if we want to just make that cut, the first generalization, meaningful on animates, not meaningful on inanimates, we kind of have to verify that second piece. So the question that this set of papers is going to address, or at least try to address, is the question of whether gender is meaningful on inanimate nouns just the same. And the answer is more or less yes. There is at least some relationship between meaning and gender that we can measure. And I'm going to go through kind of 3 different studies that we did in recent years. There are others, but these are the ones that fit in the time that kind of show and explicate that relationship a bit. Ooh. So the first study is one that we did. It came out earlier this year. One of the other co-authors is Ryan, who's part of this group as well. And this study is called On the Relationships Between Grammatical Genders of Inanimate Nouns and Their Co-occurring Adjectives and Verbs. So if we want to ask this question, oh, I don't know, should I pause or is it okay? Any questions? No? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I will continue. Oh, do you have one or no?
Oh, no, I was just gonna mention it to the group. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat of the Zoom app at any point. But yeah, no, you're good. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries. Okay, cool. So this is the first part, the first study. If we want, so we want to check whether there's any relationship between the grammatical gender on nouns and the lexical meanings of those nouns. And so that sort of relationship would be that like gender overlaps in meaning somehow. That's the sort of thing that we want to look for. And to do that, we need some proxy for the meaning of nouns. Like we all kind of know what nouns mean, but there's many different ways to like intuitively, we know what a cat is, we know what a pumpkin is, etc. But how to operationalize that into something that you can actually measure statistical significance on is a trickier proposition. So if we take kind of the generative linguistics approach, things like cat would be a property of animals that are cats, or like a function that given a cat will tell you whether the thing that it was fed in was a cat or not. These things are hard to operationalize mathematically. So we're going to kind of go for a different, I think, complementary way of thinking about lexical semantics that's more quantifiable. Yeah, quantifiable. So let's dive into a little bit more about the intuitions behind the proxy that we used. So let's say we have these three inanimate objects. We have a pumpkin, a moon, and a clock. How are we going to get at the meaning of these things? Well, we could think about how we describe them. So all three of those things are round. We could think about things that are different between them, other ways that we talk about them. The pumpkin is a food, the moon and the clock are not. The clock is made by humans, others are not made by humans. The moon will be around for a long, long time, but the clock and the pumpkin won't. Maybe the clock will be around longer than the pumpkin and less than the moon. You know, there's various different options. And so when people talk about concepts, the way that they talk about them sort of reflects the meanings of those concepts. At least in some respect, we can zoom in particularly on properties of those concepts that they might share or not share. And properties across languages are usually or often realized as adjectives. So we can see that corpus co-occurrences of these different properties will differ. And in fact, the frequencies of the collocations of like adjectives and nouns will differ, sort of reflecting some lexical meaning of those things. So like all of them are things that can be round, but only some are things that can be handmade. And so one way to operationalize this is to look at corpus co-occurrences. So what if gender reflects some semantic properties of the object that are particularly salient for a given language? So let's say the way that people talk about pumpkins in Spanish and German are different. Then we might expect that the occurrences of different adjectives that go with the word pumpkin will also be different. Yeah, so the distributions over adjectives which modify nouns, let's say nouns that are split into different genders, might semantically overlap with the noun gender. So it's possible that the gender on the particular noun will have some correlation with the types of adjectives that are used for that noun. And that's the sort of thing that we want to measure as our proxy for meaning. So how much do adjectives inform us about noun gender? That's the main question. And so if you're like listening to me talk about this, you might be thinking of other resonances in your head in the domain of linguistics, potentially the Harrison-Firth distributional hypothesis, right? You shall know a word by the company it keeps. I mean, in this particular thing, I'm talking just about adjectives. But you know, that's sort of the underlying bedrock for a lot of the NLP tools that we all use today. So that's kind of an important resonance. Another resonance you might be thinking of, if you're on the more of the psycholinguistic side, is on Lara Boroditsky's experiments on adjective production. I just want to say a bit more on that one, so we're all in agreement. This work is part of a larger effort on Neo-Whorfian linguistics, for example. And basically, the Boroditsky claim is that gender on inanimates actually reflects something of the meaning that gender has on animates. So there might be some stereotypes about people which somehow get put onto objects. This is a bit of a crazy claim. At least I intuitively, at the first thinking of this initially, was like, what do you mean? Like, it seems a bit crazy. If you have a table in Spanish that's feminine, like, is there anything woman-like about that table? It seemed a bit crazy. But of course, it's worth kind of thinking about this intuitive idea a little more before immediately discounting it. Of course, tables, inanimates like tables, don't have any natural gender. They don't have gender identities, clearly, because they're not conscious. There's not really a cultural relation between tables and people. It's hard to know what that would be. And another reason to think that there's not at least a standard relationship between stereotypes on people and inanimate objects is that languages will differ in which genders they assign to different concepts. The three examples I picked above, you know, moon and pumpkin and clock, across Spanish and German, they have different genders on these three objects. So that's kind of why I picked them. So if there's some stereotype there, it must be, you know, specific as well to the culture. So the Boroditsky claim is one to contend with, even though it's a bit sketchy. Just to give it a bit more meat, I want to quote a paper by one of the students of Lara, and she's also in this et al., which says, we might expect entities without biological sex to acquire stereotypically masculine or feminine properties as a result of being assigned to a grammatical category. So this is actually even a stronger claim than I initially suggested. It's a causal claim. It says because people, or it suggests that because people in Spanish think of or assign tables feminine, therefore we might expect that the table will acquire a stereotypically feminine property. And what that means then is that people talk about tables in Spanish, they might use more stereotypically feminine adjectives. So they did a kind of pilot study. It's not peer reviewed. I think it's in like a chapter, a book chapter or something, where they did an attempt at checking whether people have this behavior, whether they actually think about objects in this way. And what they did is they took bilinguals of, say, German and Spanish, and they presented them in each of their languages with nouns that differ in gender in those languages. So here's an example: bridge, it's feminine in German and masculine in Spanish. And they asked those people, you know, when speaking German, say the first 3 adjectives you think go with this bridge, and when speaking Spanish, say the first 3 adjectives that go with this bridge. And they found that people, or they report that people will use more feminine stereotypic adjectives like elegant if the language marks that object as feminine, and masculine ones like sturdy when the language marks it as masculine. So this suggests potentially some anecdotal evidence maybe in support of this claim. Of course, it's very sketchy, very intuitive. So then we kind of, you know, taking this as an inspiration perhaps, we can ask at a larger scale, maybe at a level of the whole corpus, can we find similar relationships? And then, so it's the first step. How meaningful is gender on inanimate nouns? You know, restate the question. But the first step would be, is there any relationship at all between gender and the choice of adjective? And then secondarily, we can ask, following up on the Boroditsky assertion, is that relationship one of stereotypicality? So what we do is we try to quantify the amount of information in bits shared between gender on nouns and the adjectives that modify those nouns. So briefly, we selected sentences in a couple of languages, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Polish, and Russian. We selected these mainly because they were easy to access using Wikipedia, but it'd be great to extend beyond this soon. And we took sentences like this one: I want to cross a robust or strong bridge. And we kind of ablated all of the gender information. So we've replaced each verb or adjective with its lemmatized form, so the infinitival or the part without the final gender suffix, to basically remove all signs of overt morphological gender. And then we trained a parser to pull out the collocations, particularly the amod collocations for adjective and noun, to see what the relationship might be there. We also want to look at the relationship between verbs and nouns, because again, what the noun is constrains what sort of verbs you can use with it. So there are selectional restrictions between verbs and their arguments, different ones. So for example, you can't, let's see, if you have something like, you know, freedom was afraid, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? It's not the sort of thing that freedom can do. So it seems like verbs, well, I guess it's an adjective, but you know what I mean. Imagine a verb is, how about I kicked freedom? That's a better one. You can't kick freedom, like it's not an object. So there's some restrictions on selectional restrictions on which verbs as well, if we want to look at those. So we pulled out the collocations here using a dependency parser, including verbs and amods, so basically the direct objects, subject, and also indirect objects. And we wanted to measure like the strength of the relationship between these things. However, adjectives and verbs are not the only things in a noun's context that might belie the meaning. Since we wanted to look across the whole corpus, we weren't exactly sure the size of the effects that we might see. So we wanted also to have like a lower bound, a floor that we don't expect any effect from, just so we know whether the effects we do see are like of a reasonable size to be interpretable. So we looked a bit more at other sorts of grammatical markers like number and case, which presumably have no relation to grammatical gender. So it's not, at least it's hard to imagine that feminine nouns would be more pluralizable than masculine nouns, or would come in different cases. It seems a bit unexpected. So we checked for that as sort of a floor. So all this set out, you probably are wondering, how do we actually measure information? We use mutual information, which is an information theoretic quantity that does basically correlation. We wanted to see if gender interacts with meaning, given sort of like, does it decrease the entropy over choice of adjective or choice of gender? to know the other. That's like the main question that mutual information allows you to answer. So if you have some amount of entropy over adjectives in a corpus, if you know the gender of the noun that that adjective modifies, do you have less entropy? The answer is you either have the same amount or less, right? And mutual information is the amount by which the entropy is decreased. So it's a measure of correlation. So in order to kind of make that measure of correlation a bit more interpretable, we also normalized it, so you get a percentage. So you can think of the result that I'm about to show you as a percentage of entropy reduced, which is similar to how much information you get about the relationship between the two. Okay, if mutual information between the two quantities is significantly greater than 0, they are correlated, they're not independent. That's a kind of the one sentence summary. So a few experimental details for those of you who are excited about mutual information. We use the empirical estimates from the Wikipedia corpora and just plug those in. So the probabilities of the words from Wikipedia. There are other things we could do, but we kind of did that as an initial first step. And to get significance, we randomly regendered all the nouns that we had. So if it had been, let's say, a feminine noun in German, we would just give it either neuter or masculine. And then we did that a bunch of times. I think it was 10,000 times to create a distribution. And then we used that kind of as a non-parametric test for significance. Wanted to see if our empirical sample fell past the 95% of the distribution. Okay. All right. So results. I kind of already gave away the punchline. There is a relationship. But the relationship holds across all of the languages we surveyed. And it's slightly different amounts of entropy reduction depending on the language, but it's around 8 to 11% across the board. So there is a measurable, and it's statistically significant. So there is a measurable and significant relationship between gender on nouns and the adjectives that modify those nouns. We found also significant relationships for verbs and the gender on their subjects and verbs and the gender on the direct objects. These, at least for the subjects, it was only significant for 4 of the 6 languages. For verbs, it was significant for all. And the magnitude of these effects, it was pretty big for direct objects, which if you're interested in hierarchical syntax, you might think, oh, that makes some sense because the direct object is closer hierarchically to the verb than the subject would be. So it could have some results of actually hierarchical syntactic structure as well. I got to explain that in more detail, but I found this a very exciting effect. We also found that the floor comparisons, none of those were significant. And they were very, very small amounts of bits. I mean, overall here, at least for the adjective and gender comparison, the amount of bits is relatively small. Like overall, the percentage is like reasonable, but the amount of bits is 0.1. So it's a relatively small effect, though significant. Given this, we wanted to kind of get an idea of whether the Boroditsky idea, the stereotypical human gender idea, was likely to be right. And so we kind of wanted to just poke around a little bit after we had kind of got the main result to find out which adjectives might be driving the effects. And we didn't see any obvious stereotypical adjectives in this bunch. I mean, at least for Spanish and German, which are here, which are the ones that Boroditsky et al. Looked at. We don't, we see things like best, new, large, small, this sort of thing, which don't necessarily strike you as stereotypical. They're not any of the adjectives on the lists, let's say, from the stereotyping literature on gender. Same with German. There are things like, new, wide, this sort of thing. So at least intuitively, it doesn't jump out at you. I mean, we're going to need something more systematic to be sure, but it doesn't jump out. If you look at the top most common adjectives even, nothing here jumps out. Seems like maybe some other semantic information might be relevant, like temporal meaning perhaps. So things like first or same or following or next in the context of like years or months, those seem to matter. So at least, even though we've shown that there's a relationship, we can't necessarily adduce additional evidence in favor of the Boroditsky claim that the relationship is a stereotyping relationship. But yes, the summary of the first bit is that we find an association between inanimate nouns and grammatical gender, at least for 6 languages, suggesting that grammatical gender association is less arbitrary than one might think, even in inanimates. So yes, there is some meaning there. So there, as I pointed out, there were some limitations. It's a bit of a small effect, and it would be great to do further psychological testing to see whether this effect has implications for how humans process language. So yes, this is the first step. And I'm going to pause here and see if anybody has anything to add or ask.
I might have a
feel
quick
free.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
You probably mentioned this in the methods and I just wasn't paying enough attention. Did you correct for frequency? Like, how did you deal with common collocations? Like in the last year where last is treated as an adjective, and then perhaps in Wikipedia, you got hundreds of examples of last year. Did you correct for that at all?
So we didn't actually have a higher ceiling on collocations, but we did have a lower ceiling.
Okay.
It would be interesting to check whether removing the higher ones would remove the effect. I wouldn't necessarily be, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a smaller subset of collocations that drive the effect. It might be the frequent ones, it might be something else. But yeah, I don't think we've checked it, so I don't have a great answer, but I could run it and see.
Yeah, just curious. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have one, but I want to make sure I let people who are not hosting ask their questions first.
I have one question. Hey, Adina.
Hey.
So I think it touched upon this by the end there. But like the gender of some of the nouns will be kind of clustered by semantics for some categories, right? Like so I think it's related to something that you might still be doing, but like, would it make sense to just control for the semantics, like do the mutual information between like a gender and adjective conditioned on some kind of semantic representation that is void of the gender? I don't know, like it might be tough to get rid of that signal of gender inside semantics, but
yeah, I mean, I think maybe some of the experiments that I did with you or that you did with me might be conditioning on some things that are relevant, but yeah, I don't think we can completely ablate the gender signal. Do you have an idea of how one would do that?
Yeah, like there's some methods to like linearly remove gender information from like word to vec or something like this, right? But if you, instead of using full mutual information, try to use something like the information which only constrains the connections inside like linear relationships, that could work. I'm not sure. I'm just like thinking about how to get rid of the semantic clusters in there, which could be cool.
Right, yeah, okay, I get what you're going for. So sort of like the amnesic probing sort of
that kind
approach
of idea, but yeah.
Could be interesting. I mean, what would then be left if we got rid of the clusters? Let's say that like drug names are often feminine in Spanish or something. Like if we got rid of those sort of arbitrary sublexical clusters, then we could, is the idea that the stereotypical part might still remain?
Yeah, like you would keep like you would have a kind of like two cases. You're trying to predict the adjectives from the semantics void of gender, where you remove gender, and then with gender. So like the general clusters of like drugs are feminine or something like this would help you predict the adjectives at the first run, at the controlled one, but then you had to use specifically gender to do better than that on the second one. So it could give you that control, which could be like,
yeah, that would be great.
a nice experiment.
Yeah, it's a cool idea to compare between the two. I like that. Yeah, it's a cool
Okay.
question. Might be fun. If you want to work on it, let me know.
Yeah, let's chat.
So you had one?
Yes, yeah, if that's okay, and thank you for those questions, guys. I guess my immediate first thought is okay. So if I'm understanding this analysis, and it's very possible that I'm fairly new to linguistics. These analyses were done like within each language, but I guess what I'm curious to understand is like were those relationships consistent across languages? So like, for example, in like if you had multiple languages where the word bridge was feminine, was that relationship to the word elegant or similar words consistent across those languages?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I didn't look at particular collocations, but
oh, and that's just an example. I mean, like where the word was feminine in multiple languages, or where the same word was masculine in multiple languages, was the strength of that relationship or direction of that relationship consistent, I guess?
some of the later part I'm gonna present might start to get at that question, but for the collocations, yeah, I didn't look at like similarities between the collocations as opposed to within the like vertical of the language. I didn't look in the horizontal for particular collocations, but that's also a cool question, because it could be that particular collocations, like the number of languages that have the same gender for this word that the collocation is the same in, might give you some additional cross-lingual signal. That'd be pretty cool. Yeah, that's a cool idea. I have not checked this, but that would be neat. Okay, maybe I'll continue.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll let you know if any questions pop up in the chat. And thank you for answering my question too.
Right, so this brings us on to the next study. So we, at least in the first bit, this is called Quantifying the Semantic Core of Gender Systems. Some of the same collaborators, just in different orders. And this one was a slightly earlier paper. Well, earlier in the sense of published earlier, but they were roughly at the same time. So for the first study, we looked at collocations as a particular proxy for lexical semantics, but there's many other kind of notions of semantics you could consider. So why would we necessarily want to use dependency parsers to pull out collocations? Why not find some other way to more directly measure the relationship between meaning and gender? And so, of course, if we want to find a direct measure, there are some kind of obvious candidates from the NLP side. Thinking back to Harrison Firth, a word is characterized by the company it keeps. This is sort of the motivation that everyone points to for using word embeddings, right? So what about seeing if we find the same results, but using kind of a slightly different operationalization of gender? So distributional word vectors, of course, these should be pretty known about within this circle. But what it basically does is it predicts from a particular sentence which words are there. So if we want to get the meaning of fine in the sentence, I'm selling these fine leather jackets, we might want to put in all the context words into predicting fine, and that's kind of how you learn the vector for fine, used in the classic way. And these vectors are shown to reflect various semantic relationships, such as analogies. I mean, it's a bit more complicated, but they have kind of powered a lot of the advancements in NLP, suggesting that they are actually encoding some meaningful notion of semantics. So it's sort of a complementary, but not exactly overlapping proxy for lexical meaning. So if we take these word vectors just out of the box, maybe something like fast text, some static word vectors, we can ask, are they correlated with the gender on nouns, and how strongly? So we look at a kind of a different measure of correlation here, which is canonical correlation analysis. This exposes the relationship between covariances in two sets. So we can ask whether we can correlate a one-hot gender embedding. So for German, which has 3 genders, it might be like 1, 0, 0 for feminine, 0, 1, 0 for masculine, etc. Can we correlate that sort of gender embedding with the like a word embedding from some repository like fasttext? So this seems like a straightforward thing to do. Are they correlated? But there's kind of an issue with doing it straight out of the box. And the issue is that these word embeddings kind of already encode information about gender. So then we might be asking, like, is this word embedding that encodes information about gender correlated with gender? And then the answer would be like, of course, because it already encodes gender. So it's like, seems a bit circular. So can we find some notion that doesn't encode gender so directly? There's also a lot of research showing this. And I think this is sort of the line of work that Thiago was talking about with orthogonalizing away the gender. That's another thing we could explore here. But for us, we're trying to find some notion that does not encode gender without doing something like orthogonalizing. That could be another approach. At least for this work, we took a different direction, and we took kind of a translation approach. So we took the nouns in a particular language and said, if we translate them into a genderless language, then we can use the embeddings from that language as sort of a genderless proxy. So if we take Spanish mesa, let's say for table, we translate that into table in English. Table in English doesn't have any gender marking. So obviously the grammatical gender is gone, but in most cases they mean the same thing. It's not that there's a huge difference between tables in Spanish and tables in English. They're both the same, more or less the same object. So can these translated embeddings be sort of a notion of the universal shared semantics of particular nouns? So if we have, you know, Spanish and English, whatever the translation is the universal portion of the semantics. Of course, there's kind of an issue, which is that yet another issue is that words actually have, languages have different words in them. So not all of the words in English are found in Spanish and vice versa, and the same for any pair of languages. So how do we figure out which words to even compare, or which ones to measure from? We first need to get a list of words that are similar. So we're using kind of a SWOTish list plan. But also, it's possible that there might be some of the words in the list might be present in one. Let's say some of the words in the Spanish list might be present in English, or they might not. So maybe we want more genderless donors than just English. So we wanted to get translated words in multiple languages, and then we can actually try to also account for the cultural differences between genderless languages. So if we just look at, let's say, Spanish and German to English, we might, and we find some correlation, we might just be discovering that there's a cultural similarity between these two languages, like tables are super similar. But if we also go from like Spanish to Chinese, that's supposedly a very different culture, and we still find the correlation, then it's not just a function of the universal semantics and the cultural similarity, but mostly the universal semantics portion. So if they are correlated in all cases, then we can say it's robust across cultures. And so we wanted to pick a bunch of unrelated languages for the genderless donors. So then there's another issue. Languages differ in which nouns are contained in their lexica. So there's this, I like this little comic because I think it's true. Did you know suburban white males have over 100 words for lawn? Like everyone always says, like, oh, people from up north, like Inuit people have 100 words for snow, but also suburban white guys have 100 words for lawn. So there is definitely something to be said about the lexicon of different languages differing based on cultural expectation. So we have to find SWOTish lists basically to get the same, at least as the nouns that are most translatable potentially, the nouns that are least likely to shift based on culture. So we did this as well. We used 18 gendered languages and 5 genderless donors to kind of check both of those issues off. We used, for the genderless donors from different language families, so English, Turkish, Korean, Japanese, and Mandarin Chinese. And for the gender languages, it's primarily Indo-European, but we did our best. And so we got a aligned list of concepts from this European bank that basically will get you all of the words for like common items. So, hands and faces and rocks and trees and these things that are common across languages. So we could have an aligned list. So what did we find? We take the aligned list and translate it from the gendered language into each of the 5 donors, and then look at the correlation between the one-hot gender embedding in the gendered language and the word embedding from the donor language. So what do you think? Are they correlated? This is the results. It's kind of a crazy big table. I'm going to break it down for you. So on the y-axis is the correlation coefficient, and on the x-axis is the gendered language. The colored bars are for the genderless donor. So the light colored bars are English. So there are significant correlations between the gender embeddings for the languages on the X and the English embeddings for their translations in 12 of the languages. For Japanese, it held in 13. For Korean, 9. For Turkish, 9. And for Chinese, 12. So across the board, at least 9 languages had correlations between gender and the meanings of their translated word embeddings, this operationalization of meaning, suggesting that there is a correlation here. For these languages, Bulgarian, Catalan, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Russian, all of the comparisons were significant for all donors. And for some of these languages, like which HR, I don't remember what these are, but these were not significant. And you might be wondering, why would it be significant in Russian, but not in Ukrainian when those languages are so similar? We did a bit of poking around to figure this out. And the languages for which none of the comparisons were significant had smaller shared word lists. So they were just kind of less data, at least for the Ukrainian case. So there's multiple reasons one might be insignificant. But the summary of this work is that for all sample gender marking languages, they correlated with the ones that had any significant correlation. They correlated well with Mandarin and English word embeddings. These are very different languages, suggesting that there is some universal semantics here that does correlate with gender. So there is indeed some sort of semantic relationship between inanimate noun meaning and gender. We find that also kind of tangentially, this Waddish list seem to be able to provide, these like aligned concept lists, seem to be able to provide a stable way of comparing embeddings across languages. They might actually methodologically have some use in our context, which is pretty cool. Okay, should we pause? I feel like that one was a bit fast. Any questions? No? Shall I continue? Or
I have a quick question. I didn't fully understand how you got the correlation between the word embeddings in the genderless languages and gender. Was that it?
yeah.
So
So I basically
how
took like the embedding, the one hot embedding, and had the word embedding. So the one hot embedding has fewer dimensions, but canonical correlation would look at like the covariance within each embedding and then compare those covariances.
Oh, okay. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so it's a one hot embedding and it's not just like a 0 1. Oh, okay. I think it makes sense.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Thanks.
And then this may just be like my my misunderstanding on this, but was it looked like there was like the strength of that relationship, like for English, Japanese, Korean, Turkish, and Mandarin, it looked like the shape of that was fairly consistent, where English had like the highest correlation to the other languages that you studied. I was just curious, and maybe you said it and I missed it, why you thought that was that the relationships between those languages seems to be at least shaped kind of consistently.
Yeah, I don't think I had a reason for that. I don't think they were, I mean, in this case, they look significantly different within the different embeddings. But across the board, I'm not sure that's always the case. So for like French and Hebrew, there's less distance here. We didn't actually check whether those distances are significant, but I do see what you're intuitively pulling out. So the fast text embeddings for English are trained on a lot more data than the others, I think. So that could be one consideration, but I'm just brainstorming. I'd have to dig into it a bit more.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question.
I have another.
There's a lot to dig in. Oh, sorry.
Question. No. Do you think those kind of semantic clusters could be playing a role here in these correlations as well, or?
I mean, that's my yes. I think so. I don't have proof, but yeah. I mean, my hypothesis is that that's what's driving these effects in general, these semantic sublexica clusters, and that it's not necessarily something else. I mean, there might be stereotype clusters, but I don't think that that's going to be the full answer, or even might not even be an answer. So one thing we could do, given that kind of guess, is split this data by clusters and see whether the strength is stronger in particular clusters, whether the correlation is stronger. I mean, most of these nouns are like basic body part nouns or basic objects. So it's not like they have really far out there things like I don't know, like drug names or any of those other kind of far out there clusters. It's just kind of basic high frequency things. But we could try to split them by clustering.
Are they mostly kind of monomorphemic as well and stuff? So it's not like
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
That's cool.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe I'll just continue. Since this is sort of like a random little break, we had been talking a bit about Swadesh lists, and I didn't really have time to shoehorn this project in, but we also use Swadesh lists for it. So I made kind of a hacky bridge. Like, we're gonna talk about Swadesh lists. We have just a single slide on this other paper, which I thought was pretty cool, which was about measuring the similarity of grammatical gender systems in order to try to reconstruct phylogenetic relationships. And so we basically considered, we asked the question of how similar Indo-European grammatical gender systems are anyway. This might have been a question kind of tickling the back of your mind, because if you look at the list, they're largely Indo-European, and we've been looking at kind of the relations between various things in grammatical gender within languages, but not doing them between, like as Joe also picked out. And so this paper was sort of an initial attempt to look a bit as the cross-language. If we look here at the little green and yellow boxes, we know that different languages have different partitionings of their lexicons based on gender. So in German, there are 3 genders, k equals 3. In Spanish, there are 2, k equals 2. And you can kind of take those genders as different partitions of the lexicon. And so in German, those partitions would group fruit and grass together. I think that's neuter. And in Spanish, it would not. It would group fruit with moon and flower instead. I think that's feminine, but I could be wrong. So basically, the way that these partitions overlap might tell you something about the way that these languages have changed over time. So if there's a high overlap, that kind of suggests that those languages are more related potentially, since it takes time for languages to diverge. And we know that languages have diverged, at least in the European continent, and resulted in kind of different genders for different words. So we looked at these partitions over the lexicon, these gender partitions, and measured the similarity of between them. We did this with, again, information theoretic metrics. We looked at 3 mutual information metrics: mutual information, variation of information, and adjusted mutual information. And we found that we can more or less construct known language phylogenetic relationships just from the similarities of gender systems by themselves. So if you look here at the, let's say, mutual information graph down at the bottom, this tree, you can see that the language families in green and red are kept as similar. So we are able to reconstruct that those are related languages of the same family. They are more notably similar, let's say, than, let's say, so Russian and Ukrainian are pretty close, along with like Bulgarian and other sort of Slavic languages. Those are more similar than, let's say, Russian and Ukrainian are to Spanish and Catalan and Portuguese. So we are able to reconstruct these to some reasonable extent. given just the gender on nouns, which is a pretty sparse signal, right? So Swadesh lists are pretty powerful. They can help you do all sorts of stuff. Yeah. So then that brings me to the last part. This one was the most recent paper, even though maybe not temporally most recent in terms of publication date. But we wanted to kind of dig into more specifics on noun classification systems. And Eleanor and Thiago are on this paper, so happy to see you guys here. Hope I do our work justice. So we wanted to see whether declension class, which I'm going to explain in a minute, is sort of related to gender, but it's a more specific thing, not necessarily like a subset of genders, but generally a more specific classification system. Whether we find any relationship between that more specific noun classification system and meaning. And we also wondered whether we find relationships to form. So historically, there's been a lot of discussion about the relation between meaning and form of words, back to Saussure and subsequent. So we wanted to kind of see if we can measure and disentangle the contributions of declension class, both to form and meaning, see if there's any sort of shared relationships there. So this was a step to move beyond just gender. And so gender is pretty common across languages, but also declension class is pretty common across languages. And declension class is how you group nouns based on things like their gender, but also differences in their form based on number and case. So as people or models try to learn languages with these classification systems, we have to memorize which languages go in which classes, and it would be useful we have to memorize this in order to create the right sentence, as we saw earlier with gender. The same is true of declension class. It might spread across the whole noun phrase. So we have to memorize which classes these nouns fall into. So for example, in German, say we have these 4 animals, dog, cat, worm, and mouse. We can see that each of these will have a different form in different case and number, configurations. So Hund will go to Hunde, Katze will go to Katzen, Wurm will go to Würmer, and Maus will go to Mäuse. If you go to the genitive singular, a different case and number specification, the forms will shift again. And if you go to dative plural, the forms will shift again. So these classes that these nouns fall into tell you how to basically inflect these nouns. So every noun in German falls into one of these classes. Many languages have such classes. Let's say that we know those 4 animals. We know which class they fall into. If we're given a new noun, I'm trying to learn German, let's say, and I'm given this new noun, Frosch, how do I know which class to put Frosch into? How do I know how to inflect it? How do I know how to use it in a sentence? What information is useful? And the information that's useful is, well, at least that we think is possibly useful, is form and meaning. So that's the question. For form, we know that there are various phonological factors that might be relevant for plural formation across languages. So for English, at least, the form of the plural changes depending on the form of the stem. So if we have cat that ends in a voiceless consonant, we would get cats. But if we have something like kiss that ends in a voiceless sibilant, not a normal like stop consonant, we have to have a different plural. So kisses. We have one that's a voiced consonant like dog, we would end up with dogs, not dogs, right? So there are phonological factors that condition which plural class these nouns fall into. There also might be some lexical semantic factors. I mean, earlier in this talk, I kind of motivated some of these, but there's also some suggestion that declension classes might be like numerical classifiers or numeral classifiers in other languages. And these have semantic correlations, so it's possible declension class might have some lexical semantic correlations as well. And we're curious about whether both together might help you predict class. So if you know the form of the word and you know it's something about its meaning, are you able to use that to predict which class it falls into? So we zoomed in even more here. So in the previous studies, we had a wider swath of languages, but for this one, we kind of zoomed in on German and Czech. We did this because they have relatively transparent orthographies. So the mapping from phonological form to text was fairly straightforward. So we didn't have to go and get a bunch of IPA. We could use text and realize that that was because it was a pretty straightforward proxy for the phonology. We also could use Wikipedia in these languages. They have large dumps, open sourced. They also both have large and well-established linguistic traditions theoretically. So we have a lot of annotation on which classes, which nouns go into. So that was good. And we had fluent or native speaker authors who were linguists. So we could actually ask people who know these languages for help. One of those is Eleanor. So then we come, at least in this part, to the summary question. So how much information does noun form and or meaning share with declension class? That's the question we want to ask. So again, we use mutual information. So symmetric quantity measures how much information in bits two random variables share. So you can take, let's say, the mutual information between class C and W form, and that is defined as the entropy over the class minus the entropy of class given the form. So that can tell you about the shared mutual information. You can define the entropy over the class as basically the negative sum of the probability of class times the log probability of class. This is pretty standard mutual information stuff. And you can do the conditioned by basically taking this formula here. So if we subtract these two things, we'll get the mutual information. That's how we calculated it. And so mapping the questions onto this mutual information, we wanted to look at for phonological factors or orthographic factors, the mutual information between class and word form. For lexical semantics, the mutual information between class and the vector. So that's the word embedding. And then we want to look at all together. So three-way mutual information between class, the word form, and the embedding. So an aside, we've been talking about gender. Declension class does interact with grammatical gender, but it's not reducible to it. And we know that gender has a correlation with form. So we want to make sure when we're measuring declension class, if we find a correlation with form or with meaning and declension class, that we're not just like finding actually the gender and meaning correlation. We want to make sure that those are distinguished. So we actually conditioned on gender as well to figure out how much information form and meaning share with declension class above and beyond the contribution of gender. So we were able to verify the prior findings from the previous works that I described. So it is true that for Czech and German, there is a correlation between between declension class and gender. And we can basically control for gender by conditioning on it. That's what we did. So we kind of update our question to how much information does noun form and or meaning share with declension class given gender. This is a way to control. And so for our results, we found that for both languages, there's a significant amount of information shared between declension class and form. So this is significant. You can see for the normalized mutual information that it's a relatively large percentage of entropy reduction. For meaning, we also found that it was significant. It's a bit smaller, but still a reasonably large amount in terms of the normalized mutual information. And we found that for both languages, form had more of a relation to declension class than meaning did, given gender, in terms of just it's a larger effect for form, but there is still a significant relationship between declension class and meaning. We also found that for Czech, this was a stronger effect across the board than for German. We also found that the three-way interaction was relatively small for both languages, but significant, suggests there's some redundancy between form and meaning. So form and meaning contribute information about class, and they actually contribute at least some redundant information about class. So for take-home messages here, noun classification systems like gender and noun declension class, at least these two seem to share significant amounts of information with meaning. So we can use them to determine meaning and vice versa, they're correlated. Additionally, form matters for declension class, which makes sense. If you think about the English kiss, kisses, cat, cats, dog, dogs example, this would be predicted. For both languages, form shared more information with class than meaning does. And some of this information was redundant given the tripartite results. There's some more stuff in the paper. So if you want to dig into it more, you can take a look, but we're a little bit over time, so I don't want to go into that much. Okay, so I can pause here for questions, if there are any, and then we can go into like the more brainstorming portion. Any questions? No? Shall we continue?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, cool. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. I know it's like a lot too. I know you guys do 3 studies, but I was like 3. Woof. All right, it's a lot of information. Okay, so part 4, where do we go from here? I've been talking about these like relationships between form and meaning and noun classes. Let's like take some stock of what we've done, maybe some limitations, things that we can do differently in the future, or improve on, or deepen our understanding on. So first of all of these results have been discussing text data. So I use large-scale text data from Wikipedia. And text is clearly imperfect for many reasons. For one, many languages don't have any written text whatsoever, and they still might have interesting things to tell us about gender. So we're already, by restricting ourselves to text, kind of cutting out a huge portion of the typologically existing languages. Just like, that's an issue. Another issue is that, at least at the end, we looked at German and Czech because they have transparent mappings between sound and their spelling. Not all languages have such transparent mappings. So by taking text, you might be bleeding, at least, or ignoring or not picking up some of the complexities that you would get from IPA. So in future work, looking at transcriptions, IPA transcriptions would be great. The typological sampling, of course, is, as I said, is an issue. At least for the first study where we looked at collocations, we needed a parser. A lot of languages don't have parsers. So for example, if we wanted to look at a more complex, multi-leveled gender language like Swahili, it has like many genders, not just 3 or 2, we would need to have good parsers. And you know, people are working on these tools, but they're not quite there yet. So this is something that would be very cool to do. Some of the relating SIGs like Sigmorphan are working to remedy this sort of thing. Another thing that kind of is an outstanding question is the operationalization of meaning here. So we've kind of looked at word embeddings and syntactic allocations, but there's other ways that could be possible. For example, Chiago suggested also ways of changing the word embeddings, maybe removing the gender contribution in various different ways, and looking at the meaning without that and with that would also be pretty cool, different ways of asking these questions. But it might be neat to explore other options here. We also mostly talked about, entirely talked about correlation, but a lot of the questions that linguists have about the meaning of gender are causal. So the Boroditsky Neo-Worfian claims on linguistic relativity, they're claiming, at least in that Semantics quote, that there's a causal relationship between the gender on a noun and whether you get its stereotypical meaning from it. Everything I've talked about is correlational. It would be great to actually test the causal claim as well. That's something that some of us, including Chiago, have been talking about for a bit, and hopefully at some point we'll get to exploring that in a bit more detail with maybe some causal modeling. This would be a cool future direction. What are the consequences of these results? Linguists often ask, what are the structure of these lexical relationships? I was discussing with Chiago these sublexica, so clusters of words that are semantically similar and have the same gender. What are they? What's the structure of those? How many are there? Do they differ across languages? Like maybe one language has 3, maybe another language has 10, maybe that maps to gender, maybe it doesn't. How does that work? How do those relationships work? How would we even define a semantic sublexicon? It would be very cool. And although we did some initial analysis, like poking around a little bit on particular nouns in the particular languages we looked at, we don't have any more broader universal claims about any of this, and that would be really, really cool. There's a lot of work in phonology on sublexica, and it'd be really cool to do that in semantics. That's something I think someone should work on. I would love to do it myself, but if you're interested, reach out. It'd be very cool. We also have questions for language acquisition. A large part of the motivation for these projects is that I was trying to learn a new language, Ryan's always trying to learn a new language, all of our other collaborators like learning new languages. Does this relationship help you memorize something like declension class or gender? Could any of this help somebody learn a language? Potentially, it would be very cool to try. It would be great if we could engage more with the acquisition literature. Another question that I've been kind of interested in is, how do models learn language? Is it like people? In a recent paper with some collaborators, including Duga Hopkis and Kate McCurdy, we look a bit closer at German plurals as a case study for determining whether models kind of learn how to make plural forms in a way that's comparable to how humans make plural forms. And we show here in this picture that if you give like a kind of a control token to a seek-to-seek model that's doing morphological plural inflection, different plural classes, so like the Katze to Katzen versus the Mutti to Mutis class, kind of look at different portions of the noun and rely on the control gender token to different degrees. So it seems like it's sort of a mix. They do things sort of like people, sort of not like people. The acquisition behavior of these two different things, models and people, they don't completely map one to one. And so this is something cool that can be done with this sort of work. Many more interesting questions. So how do gender systems or declension class systems relate to other noun classification systems like East Asian classifiers? So we had some early work on classifiers, but the descriptions, linguistic descriptions of whether you have like a classifier system or a gender system, they often have kind of overlapping linguistic properties, and it can be really hard if you look typologically to determine what system is which. So for example, some collaborators of mine are looking at Koya, an African language. I don't remember which family. I think it's, I don't remember, but it's a language from Africa, and it has gender marking concord all the way through the noun phrase, all the way up to like the determiner or demonstrative, but it seems to have a relation to mass count, which is sort of like a numeral classifier. And so how do you reconcile these things? Like classifiers generally don't have concord, but gender does. Gender often doesn't give you any information about mass count, but classifiers do. But then this language seems to have multiple of these properties, so it's really hard to know. It'd be really neat if some of these quantificational approaches, like the kind that we talked about, or not quantificational, quantitative approaches like the ones I talked about here, might actually give you like boundaries on how to define these different classification systems better. So maybe there's some mutual information shared with kind of the noun and the marker versus the marker and the adjective versus the marker and the kind of determiner. It might be kind of neat to use that as a boundary to define these different types of classification systems. It would be very cool, because right now the boundaries are fluid and there's massive typological diversity. Another question is, why does concord exist? Whenever I think about gender, I'm like, what is this? Why do we change the form of the adjective given the gender of the noun? Why do we change the form of the determiner given the gender of the noun? How far does the spread? Why do languages differ and how far this spreads? We actually have the tools now to maybe ask those questions. So we know that the gender on the noun helps tell you something about the meaning of the noun. There's some relationship there. Maybe having the gender marker early helps you predict which noun is coming later. Maybe it's got some sort of actual online processing consequence. Or perhaps the amount of information that the gender tells you about the noun meaning affects how far the gender will spread. So if it's less information, maybe the gender needs to spread farther. If it's more information, maybe it doesn't. I mean, these are kind of interesting questions that a quantitative approach allows you to even ask. I have no answers, but it'd be cool if someone checked it out. Right, so that was like the brainstorming question, but in summary, we found significant information theoretic correlations between gender and lexical meaning, notably for even inanimates. We also found relationships between declension classes and meaning, as well as declension classes in form and declension classes in gender, all to differing degrees, and some of that was contributing the same information. And I think that this is kind of a good set of case studies to argue that multilingual NLP tools and large corpora can actually potentially at some point help address some of the enduring questions we have about the nature of language, like, is gender meaningful? So I hope that that's something you all want to work on too. Thanks. Can take questions if you have any.
I can't tell if those little hands are people raising their hands or if they're clapping, but if you have a question, just feel free to unmic. I do as well, but I want to wait for others. Sorry, Ariman just unmiked.
Yeah, so I was wondering about like morphological interference with gender assignment. So like I know you use Swadesh lists in one of them to sort of get like very like base word forms that probably are not morphologically complex, but like
Right.
like in compounds and like derivational suffixes that can also sort of add a signal of gender interference, right? Because those have a semantic signal associated with them. So is there like some way to like account for how much that contributes to the correlation? Or
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. So in the first study, we looked at monomorphemic the Swadesh lists were largely monomorphemic as well, but we haven't done a systematic study on multimorphemic nouns and how those compare to the monomorphemic ones. You're definitely right. In German, there are feminine suffixes and this whole thing. It would be very cool to check that out. Compounds would also be really exciting. Yeah, we haven't looked at that specifically, mostly been focusing on the monomorphemic case, but it obviously matters. And I think one of the struggles that we've had with that is I generally don't like the morphological parsers. I think they often miss a lot of morphemes. So we don't have like the tools that I would want to, actually split the morphemes the way I want them split, so we could do all of these comparisons more systematically. But it's an important question, and I want to work on it. I think more people should work on this. Might not be a satisfying answer, but that's where it is so far.
Yeah, I was actually running in the same issue. I'm sort of looking in the opposite direction. What is the relationship between like gender assignment and phonological and phonotactic form using WUG words? So like a lot of the, like if you train a model in a supervised way, it just learns like what kind of suffixes are likely to be associated with, feminine or masculine, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the declension classes paper at some point, we had done some truncations of like stem final, at least for German, I think it was stem final consonants that the model seemed to be relying overly on to kind of try to cut those things apart. But it was really noisy and needed a lot of kind of hand fiddling, so I don't think it made it into the final paper. But we found that at least tentatively with those kind of messy experiments, if you truncate the stem internal information that gives you a lot of gender, there's still a lot of gender correlation. There's still some remaining in the rest. So for German, if you cut the final vowel off, or the final consonant off of the stem, you still get some relationship. But my guess is, depending on the language, it's going to be different. And it's not exactly a morpheme at that point either. So what are you actually cutting? Just a portion of the stem? Like, is that actually well-founded? So yeah, I feel your struggle.
Yeah, that is definitely very interesting work. So thank you for presenting.
Yeah, I would love to see what you have. If you ever want to share a draft of something, I'd be very curious. Or even a paper. Feel free to send
I've
it
actually
along.
been working with Ryan, so I've like been
cool.
looking at a lot of your stuff. So it's good to hear about it.
Yeah, very cool.
I have a question. So for Portuguese and Spanish, at least, when you have plurals, you usually go with the masculine for like referring to groups, since we don't have like a neuter gender. So does that play any role in these things and in the neo-Whorfian hypothesis, and or not?
Oh yeah, I mean it's not related to the work that I'm talking about, but the Neo-Whorfian people, of course, make a lot of hay of that sort of thing. In general, I mean, the generalization cross-linguistically is that if you don't have a mixed gender marker, you probably use the masculine. German's a bit different in a way because the plural form is mostly the same as the feminine, which is kind of interesting. No one's talked about it in that way. But yeah, the Neo-Whorfian folks do make a lot of hay of this, and also with conjunct agreement. It's another thing that they talk a lot about. So if you have like a man and a woman, or 3 men and 4 women, like what happens to that noun phrase? Does it does the gender agree elsewhere as the men or women? Yeah, that would be kind of interesting to look at too. I mean, we have talked about this for a while, you and I, but how do we actually measure something similar to what we've been doing with single words with like more phrase, like larger word chunks, phrases and stuff? I don't think we have a good answer unless you came up with one that I haven't heard yet. But yeah, that would be cool to check. I mean, I'm also curious about portmanteau morphemes. So why do you get collapses where the gender information and the plural information end up being spelled out as the same chunk? And when does that happen? You know, when can you get one morpheme for both gender and plural together? Because even with German, sometimes you get the collapsed single morpheme for gender and number, and sometimes you don't. So like there might be something cool going on there too about the informativity of like each of these morphological pieces. Yeah. So yes,
Yeah,
the New Orphean people love that.
that kind of also like even if you think about just English pronouns, right? Like you have gendered pronouns, but then once you go to plural, they merge together. So yeah, maybe there's something.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, you lose losing gender distinctions in the plural is a typologically common thing. So that would be no idea how to deal with it. Don't know what it means. Anybody else?
Yeah, I definitely have a couple questions. You mentioned like really early or much earlier in the talk about that it was hard to, and please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing or misunderstanding like what you pointed out. It's hard to mathematically represent let's see different nouns using like the generative grammar approach, in that like cat is a property of animal, right? And I was just wondering like why that is that would be, I guess, my first question. Then I have another question about like you've done this work, but then you've also, if I'm not mistaken, I think you've also done work on how language models don't necessarily, there's information that there's evidence that shows that language models don't really need a lot of understanding of syntax. I'm just kind of wondering how that overlaps with this.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any overlap, but on the first question, I also have no answer. So I think we in NLP at least use word embeddings based on the distributional hypothesis as a good proxy for meaning, but there's not a clear way in which the difference between like cat and a word like every could be made quantitative. I mean, you could just assign embeddings to these syntactic, like these sort of POS-like or semantic representations. And I mean, I think people have considered that sort of thing before. But yeah, it's so for like the classic generative approach to semantics, not generative semantics, but generative linguistics, doing semantics and generative linguistics tradition. There's not much difference in the formalism between something like cat and something like table and something like shoe. And obviously these things are different. They have different meaning, but that meaning just isn't very relevant to the goals of that theory. They're looking at more how do these words compositionally interact with verbs and other things. And so in a sense, they're abstracting away entirely from the fact that a cat has fur and claws. You know, it's just not a relevant thing to that theory. So I think that might partially be why, at least, people haven't quantified it in the way that we've quantified things here. It also might be why, like, language models don't care about syntax like people do, because they're more interested in this sort of just distributional idea of how language works and less interested in the precise way in which you combine words to form syntactic hierarchical structures. So it could be related, I guess, in that way. I'm not sure how to fix it. I think that ultimately our system will need both this lexical semantic stuff that's kind of squishy and an actual structure building component or multiple that do things like, syntax, basically. We're going to need both. And I think that we are better on the squishy side than on the more kind of categorical hierarchical structure building side. Yeah, it's one of the exciting questions of language.
Right. And it sounds also like that phenomenon like is part of why, language learning is almost like it becomes like a kind of a, I don't know, to me, somewhat of a unique proxy for like whether things can be handled more easily by a more hierarchical categorical structure than like the squishy stuff. And I was just curious because you highlighted that specifically. Do you see like language acquisition as kind of like more of like a playground to experiment with these ideas and see what is easy for people to learn versus harder for people to learn? Or is like, what is it about language acquisition that that specifically kind of like ties back to this work? And that is it just that like, gender is a hard thing for people to learn if their first language is not a gendered language? That I hope I'm not dominating that too much. I run a language learning startup, so I realize I may be biased in like
Oh,
in folks fixating there.
you probably know more about it than me. Yeah, I mean, I haven't really worked on language acquisition from the linguistic side, like basically at all. Um, but the little that I would be willing to say, despite not knowing anything really about it, is that I think there's a lot bigger prior in humans than in models. And whether the language you learn has gender or not, and whether that makes it hard for you to learn a gendered language later kind of depends on a lot of things in relation to that prior and the actual input you get, right? So like some people are fine with it. It's also dependent on how old you are, like the critical theory hypothesis and all sorts of stuff. And models just don't display any of those things, it seems. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of a hand wavy. I don't know.
Well, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's like many. I'm like writing out notes of like things to go Google later from what you were saying. Sorry. Uh, but yeah, and then I guess the other part that I guess I was sorry, I've asked a bunch of questions. I'll give somebody else a shot if other folks have questions first. Daniel and Kiagbatar, and sorry if I'm mispronouncing your first name there. If either of you guys have questions.
No, it was a very nice talk, and I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Seems like you can ask your question, Joe.
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, as kind of that when you're talking about like lexical semantics being squishier and like the many of these models kind of functioning well in like a hierarchical kind of categorical landscape, like would you mind kind of going deeper into like what is it like that what is it about lexical semantics that kind of expresses itself as particularly squishy, I guess? And like is gender an example of that, or is that like specifically like what it is that makes it like more fluid?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I like about studying gender. One of the reasons I wanted to study gender is because one of the roles of language is to classify things into bins. So we say that, this thing is a cat, this thing is a dog. They have various similarities. When kids are young, they don't have those distinctions, but at some point they acquire these categories and realize that these labels are associated with those categories. And in the real world, there might be things that are kind of in between. Like if you take trees, you might graph two trees together and then like, is it an oak? Is it a beech? Like, I don't know. There's kind of both, kind of neither. And so the way in which we can cognitively classify things is very interesting to me, and gender is a particularly complex example of concept classification, basically. Both on the, if you focus on the animate side, it's incredibly complex for like social reasons and everything else, which is very cool. Some people even reject classification in total. They're like, I'm non-binary because I think classification is awful. These people exist. Very interesting. It's not linguistics in the sense that I'm talking about today, but it's very interesting. And then there's kind of the arbitrariness of these classes that's not entirely arbitrary, but sort of arbitrary. And that is also telling you something about the structure of the cognitive system. Something about the cognitive system wants these kind of classes, and it's able to memorize them even though they're a bit arbitrary, and they must be doing something. And so I'm very kind of excited and curious about what exactly those are doing for us as thinking beings. So yes, I think gender is an important example of these classifications, that just general cognitive classification systems that humans have. So it's very, I think that does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And it also kind of like talks, it hints at like, just how much more exciting work can be done, and how many of these questions are fundamentally either potentially either unanswerable or at least in some of the ways that are defined. I'm curious how you think about that, and then if like in terms of future work, like I don't know if this is like work that's already been done, but I guess this kind of is, this might be repetitive with my an earlier question I had, but like the word bruca, and I keep fixating on it because it's my last name, but it's it's feminine in German, and then masculine, right, in Spanish, right? And I'm wondering if the gender assigned to, like the gender associated with specific words is fairly consistent across languages, like whereas is table consistently feminine, etc. And like where like the point that you brought up is more of an exception than the rule.
Yeah, so that little like one slide on phylogeny is trying to get at that question. So if we take very common Swedish list words that are just very high frequency, very common across languages, can the deviations from particular related languages between whether they use the same gender for a noun tell you something about how long ago they deviated from their common like Proto-Indo-European ancestor, for example? And so it seems like over time there's a pressure to have gender change across different languages, and I'm not exactly sure where that pressure comes from. It could partially come from changes in the phonology, right? Because there's some relationship between classes and sound and the sounds that we use for those nouns. But it could also come from changes in meaning. It could also come from historical factors like languages being in contact. So there's many possible routes in which those classifications shift. And the ones that I'm interested in are the ones that are like semantically driven. So do you change the gender of a particular word because it's similar to another word of a different gender? Like, does that similarity make you want to make a sublexical clump? So is that a pressure? Is that another pressure in addition to the sound pressures and the historical pressures? That's what I'm curious about. So gender kind of has it all. It has sound, it has meaning, it has history, it has culture, it has all these different kind of trade-offs from each of these types of linguistics in one little nice chunk. I think, yeah.
You need to go. I have a
somewhat
quick
soon,
question.
yeah, but I can take one or two more. Yeah.
I was just wondering if having grammatical gender correlates with any other like a property of languages, like case marking sometimes like kind of correlates with free word order, right? But does gender correlate with anything, or?
I don't immediately know. I'm sure someone knows, but I don't immediately know. This is a good question. I'm trying to think through the languages I know to come up with any candidates for a generalization. I mean, I wonder if there's something about left-right word order. I was momentarily commenting that having concord might help you predict the noun that's coming after, sort of in a Melody Dye or Richard Futrell style analysis. So if that's true, then you might expect the linear order where the noun comes at the end of the noun phrase to be more correlated with having grammatical gender concord. But that's really just a guess.
Or having like SVO so that the V separates the S and the O and they don't get mixed together. Like their adjectives and genders or something like this don't get confused.
Could be,
also like
yeah.
Maybe dropping words because you can with words like that or co-refer easily to other parts of the sentence or yeah, I'm not sure.
You might like negatively correlate with classifiers.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because declension, class, and gender often occur together, but it's not the case that genders and classifiers or genders and declension classes occur together. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like Indo-Aryan languages where the only languages that don't have gender, they developed classifiers. And I wonder if that was like a trade-off.
Could be. I also sometimes wonder if we define these things in like descriptive linguistics as different oppositions, like, you know, you're not going to be able to have classifiers and plural markers, for example, or at least that's one of the definitions of classifiers or one of the defining features of classifier languages. But whether those divisions are correctly described, I sometimes am not sure. But yeah, it could be. They definitely correlate less with having classifiers. All right, cool. This was really fun, y'all. I probably should run soon, but I'm happy to talk about this either in the chat or you can just email me. I mean, either one is good. My email is just my name at fb.com. You'll get through to me. I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, and thanks so much, Joe, for hosting. I really appreciate the invite as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming to talk. Yeah, the fact that we dragged you 40 minutes after the talk was supposed to end is probably a good sign that pretty interesting stuff. So thanks so much for answering all these questions, for preparing this, and for sharing it with us, and for taking so much additional time to indulge.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.